I want to welcome you all to this Swindon Local Network hosted event, which I have the privilege of chairing. So my name is Walter Featherstone. And in terms of tonight's event, it really came about because we wanted to hold an event in celebration of 150 years of the IET. Now, I know it's not being called that for the full 150 years, but that's where we started out. And this is the year that we're celebrating those 150 years. But we wanted to give a bit of a Swindon twist, and therefore I'm very happy and pleased to be able to introduce Daryl Moody, who's a local expert, and I think is going to give an excellent talk on providing us with an insight into Swindon's engineering and innovation heritage, which I'm sure many of you on the call this evening, if you're from the Swindon area, have contributed to. So before I just hand over to Daryl, I just wanted to highlight some housekeeping, and that's with respect to the Q&A. So Daryl will talk in the region of probably 45 minutes, something like that, and then we'll have a Q&A session. But to ask questions, please use the Q&A tab, which you'll see, well, on my screen, it's at the bottom of the screen, and just type your question in there. Rather than the chat, for instance. So yeah, please use the Q&A, and that allows us to try and get through the questions at the end. And then, yeah, and that's the key aspect I wanted to get across. And with that, I'd very much like to offer my thanks to Daryl for volunteering to present this evening. And with that, I'll hand over to Daryl. So thank you very much. Over to you, Daryl.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm just sharing my screen, and could someone just confirm so they can see that okay?
Yep, it's all looking good.
Excellent. Okay, so my name is Daryl, and my talk this evening is called Swindon, a colony of engineers and handicraftsmen. And I'd just like to begin by thanking Graham Turner and tonight Rita and Walter as well, and the IET Swindon for inviting me to talk tonight. And I'd just like to explain a little bit about who I am and why I'm talking to you. Graham initially suggested I could do a talk where we discussed in parallel, really, the history of Swindon over the same 150 years of the IET. And I've tried to knit those together with some help from Graham and come to a kind of hybrid talk. It's a new area for me to talk to give a talk on. So just bear in mind that when I start talking about various firms and businesses, they can have quite complex histories, site histories, their names and their relationships. So I will make mistakes, and hopefully I'm not too many. But so I work for Swindon Libraries. I work at the Central Library, and I manage the local studies collection, and I've worked there since 2003. And our job is to collect, find out about, obtain, collect and keep forever anything and everything ever printed or published connected with life in the borough. That's all the parishes, every subject, every level, every format. So obviously books and reports and scrapbooks and ephemera, dissertations and things. Got about 100,000 photographs. I think it's a lot more than that now. Slides, postcards, negatives. Relevant tonight, we have huge collection of local magazines and periodicals. So we've got all the staff newsletters for Austin Rover, British Rail, Garage, GWR. You can see the list on the screen. And all the local newspapers, including Football Pink, which will get very excited about us having the famous free Saturday football newspaper. And we have all the usual things you'd expect in local studies: electoral registers, minutes, poll books. We've got every telephone book, every yellow pages ever, and thousands of maps. On the left, there's a letter from one of my sort of predecessors, Harold Jolliffe, a very prominent Swindonian. It was from the Advertiser in 1960, appealing for people to help really kickstart the collection that I oversee to this day. Since 2010, we've run something called the Swindon and District History Network. There's a few logos for some of the groups. There's a lot more involved. And I've chaired that at Central Library. And we're still meeting these days by virtual meetings, of course. But and also the Institute of Engineering and Technology. The IET has been in Swindon since the 60s, when it was the IEE, Swindon District Section. And obviously it was targeted at engineers. And as we will see in this talk, there's a very good reason why Swindon would have its own section. There's a brief history there, timeline of the IET itself, from 1871 onwards, when it was founded as the Society of Telegraph Engineers. and the various name changes as it worked through its different amalgamations, to the IEE in 1887, its acquisition of Savoy Place in 1909 during the Edwardian period, and then gradually its merger with the Institution of Incorporated Engineers, creating the IET as it is today. I managed to dig out a couple of early press cuttings. This is the announcement of the very first meeting from the Globe newspaper in 1870, announcing the inauguration of the Society for Promoting Electric Knowledge. And it just flags up the kind of scope of that. And then another news cutting, this time from the Standard from the following June, just discussing the new meeting being held at the offices of Major Bolton in Westminster, and listing all of the great and the good who were all involved at that stage. But to go back to Swindon for a moment, so there's a quotation here, and this is where my title came from the Illustrated London News in 1845, which is a fantastic publication if you're not familiar with it. That Swindon on the Great Western Railway is one of the extraordinary products of the railway enterprise of the present day. And until lately, Swindon was remarkable for nothing but heath and upland. And it's now the nursery of a new community, the seat of a well-ordered industry, and a colony of engineers and handy craftsmen. And I would say that is an exceptionally accurate overview of Swindon at that stage, really. And there's a little fact underneath it from John Chandler's book, The Swindon Phenomenon, saying that between 1851 and 1901, Old and New Swindon increased their population from 4,879 to 45,000, an increase of 822%. And as I've said there, 10 times the average for England and Wales. So something extraordinary happened in that period. This is pre-industrial Swindon. This is one of our favourite items. We have this 1773 Andrews and Jury map of Swindon. Well, it's the maps cover the whole of Wiltshire. This is Swindon. And if you know the town, that is the square of Old Town, the four main streets. You can see the lawn, the Goddard's home there, the watermills marked. And the church you can see there is the now mostly demolished Holy Rood Church. And that pretty much was it. Of course, you can see a similar tone to it in this beautiful illustration by John Luckett Jeffreys from 1850 of Holy Rood. And these quotations here, again, these are all pre-GWR, pre the arrival of engineering largely into the town. Swindon, a market town on an eminence with an extensive prospects over these neighbouring counties. And this interesting quote, the pleasantness of its situation combined with other circumstances have induced many of independent fortune to fix their residence at Swindon. And it really was a sleepy, off-the-map place, a hilltop market town with a long history. It's in the Domesday Book, but it certainly wasn't exactly at the centre of the Industrial Revolution. There's a map here from 1804, the Mansell map, which is, I believe, in New Zealand. And another quotation here from William Silto, that there was little to distinguish it really from all these other small towns in the southern England between the rolling down under the White Horse Hills and the Cotswolds. And that, as you'd guess, it was large an agricultural area, really. And whilst obviously we don't have photographs from 1806, predates photography, which interestingly has local connections in its evolution. But these early pictures here, the top left one is from a snowstorm in 1881 of Drove Road. It does capture really what the town looked like at the time when the railways arrived. This is one of our treasures from our collection. This is one of Gilbert Scott's original plans for Christchurch, the new parish church of Old Swindon, built on top of the hill to replace Holy Rood from 1850. And it's interesting for me largely because of these figures he's drawn in the foreground. I'm assuming they're generic figures of the day, but when you compare it to the next image, you can see how accurate they were. This is our oldest photograph that we have in our collection. It's somewhere around 1854, and it's a group of people stood in Swindon outside what was then, and up until very recently still was, the offices of the Swindon Evening Advertiser, which was often claimed to be Britain's first penny newspaper. And when you see those two images together, you really sort of see a generation of people who would have been in the town prior to the railways and really would have seen extraordinary change happen when a way of life that had been around maybe for several hundred years, largely unchanged, suddenly and quite brutally evolved. Another very early picture, again, this is Wood Street looking down towards the Goddard Arms, a street that's largely intact from this photograph, but you can see there the kind of tempo of life and the lack of motor vehicles and a kind of quieter old town. And down the bottom of the hill, where New Swindon and the arrival of the GWR had really started to kick off these changes, this photograph of Regent Street in the 1860s really captures the slightly Wild West element of Swindon at that time, where it was kind of a frontier town, that this was a new development in wide open countryside. And these people here lived pretty much at the end of New Swindon. If they wanted to get up into Old Town, they had to head up a muddy track past the Beehive. There wasn't a Victoria Road for them to climb up, and this was the main thoroughfare. Meanwhile, for the IET, you've got a few landmark developments. Obviously, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, 1876. You've got these huge thermal power stations coming online in London and in New York, and Marconi's radio developments at the turn of the century. And we've got a portrait there of Colonel Sir Francis John Bolton, who was instrumental in forming the precursor to the IET, the Society of Telegraph Engineers, was at its first meeting in 1871. I managed to find the original patent drawing for Graham Bell's telephone. They're held in the National Archives, but you can see these key documents there that are deposited capturing his inventions. That's actually him, I believe, demonstrating his device in the bottom right-hand corner. This is the famous Snell drawing or painting. It's a depiction of New Swindon to the right, and on the left you have the Swindon Works, pretty much within sort of the first 10 years, we think it's about 1849, of the GWR arriving. And just that surrounding open countryside, which if you live anywhere near the town now, you know is completely filled in with housing, commercial and industrial development. And you can see the sort of neat symmetry of the railway village. At that stage, I think the Mechanics Institution is just starting to take shape, but there are still several other buildings missing from that scene. And obviously that is the complete extent of New Swindon, where it just tapers off into countryside to the south. We have the original architectural drawing for the Mechanics Institution, which obviously is a building in a rather perilous state at the moment, with great effort being put into trying to find a better future for it. This is from the Architect's Journal, from Building magazine, sorry, from 1854. And another early kind of illustration capturing that same sort of era is of the refreshment rooms at Swindon Station, famously visited by Queen Victoria with her family in that first year. Always associated with controversy, actually, never quite as grand in their delivery of food as they were in their architecture. But the Railway Works arrival really did suddenly provide this sort of space age, brand new technology for the town, drawing in people from far afield, and particularly children, young people who'd grown up in rural areas in small villages coming to work in this town. This set of pictures taken in the 1870s, and what we presume is a very early morning or a Sunday, capturing the development. These pictures now, these are from the 1920s, and these are some aerial pictures taken of Swindon by balloon, we believe. No, beg your pardon, that's not, they were by early aircraft, capturing Swindon from the air at that stage, just as it starts to creep out. And again, you can see the railway village there, the Mechanics Institution in the middle, and the large workshops of various kinds of the works gradually filling up all those spaces. And again, you've got this view showing the Great Western Railway, the GWR Park and St Mark's Church, again, built with its best side facing towards the railway line, because that's the side they wanted to show best to the public. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about some elements of Swindon history before we start moving into the engineering, really. Around 1910, this picture was taken. This was the annual juvenile fete, which began in the late 19th century. Every child was told to bring a cup. They were given a free piece of cake, which became a rather gigantic affair to actually manage the delivery of that. Hence Mr. Harvey here and his patented multiple cake cutting machine, built in the 1890s. It allegedly cut a 2-ton, 1,700 weight of cake at 65 pounds per minute. And there you go, him showing off his device. Obviously, transport dominates a lot of Swindon's history at this period, not just the trains, but other forms of vehicles. There was a huge cycling craze and numerous cycle dealerships and manufacturers across the town. Edwards on the corner of Wood Street and Albert Street, one of the most famous. And if you magnify those posters, you can see these advertised the various models that were for sale, the Viking, the Quadrant, and others. And one of my favorite pictures here of some young, dashing Swindon gents showing off their penny farthings in 1887. These are just in the old town, just outside the Goddard Arms. And one of the many, many cycling clubs, again, a penny farthing there on the right. This is about 1890, something like that. But then obviously with this huge railway industry and this gigantic number of workers and their families, it raises the possibility of much wider industry really, and a much more diverse workforce. A picture here from 1902 of the Cellular Clothing Company at Morris Street in Rodmont, which is adjacent to the works effectively. And at that time, there's one of the two main employers of Swindon women, along with Constance, both of which are clothing manufacturers at that time. In 1895, you have the first electric lighting order for Swindon, 1895, and the beautiful thatched farm buildings you see on the left were on Corporation Street. That's Lower Escott Farm, and gradually you end up instead with what we have on the right, which is the first electricity power station for Swindon with its chimney. If you look in that picture in the bottom right-hand corner of it, that brick structure, which survived a lot longer, although still partially demolished now. And underneath is a press announcement advertising for tenders for the erection of that chimney and its associated buildings from 1901. And here's a picture inside we have. I don't think we have a date for this, but it's fairly early. The Swindon Corporation's, the Corporation Street station supplied the power through the 3 200 kilowatt dynamos. Similar equipment was in use over the road in the Swindon Works. And of course, in 1929, the whole of this switched over to Morden Power Station. And this site became part of the Swindon Corporation bus depot. I stumbled across this whilst compiling this talk. It appears to be a kind of basic overview of electric safety for Swindon residents. I don't have a date on it. There is a phone number, which kind of nails it down a little bit. So it's going to be fairly early 20th century, but I'm not sure of the exact date. It's from A. Nicklin, who was the engineer and manager for Swindon's electricity department. And some very good advice there. Don't allow people to tamper or experiment with your electricity. Don't replace blown fuses with any old pieces of wire. And also, and this is the interesting thing for me, that it's an era when electricity had to be really sold to people as the way forward, that there was a kind of marketplace of options really. In electricity, there was a zeal for it from key players. So electricity provides the best, most convenient, most economical and safest light, heat and power in the house. There we go. At that time, of course, we have, or just prior to that, the famous kind of war between DC and AC, personified by Edison and Tesla. Tesla, obviously a former employee of Edison and was a keen proponent of AC power. Very public and high profile, probably did a great deal to shape people's perceptions of electricity. And I think both were capable of quite strange and sometimes quite unsavory public stunts to demonstrate the power. Yeah, and obviously DC was almost in some ways the first format. It was AC that was a sort of a technical development. But back in Swindon, after that electricity power station coming online in 1903, the next step really was the introduction of trams. And there seemed to be a lot of Edwardian humour about the idea of Wiltshire yokels dealing with trams. And feel free to read the caption there in your own attempt at a Wiltshire dialect. But most of it seems to rely on the idea that the Wiltshiremen are going to find trams baffling and frightening, and they may be being pulled along by fishing rods. In line with most Edwardian comic cartoons we have, and we have quite a few, the jokes are often absolutely impossible to really reconstruct later on, but these ones are some of the clearer ones. Mr. Dooley, who appears on a few, he obviously was a comic character, And he's learning how to balance almost like a tightrope, really. He's ready to walk on narrow pavements after the road widening for the trams. And it didn't go too well. There he is after he's come back, and no room to walk. And a slightly more stylized one there, probably again about 1903, 1904, 1905. This is actually the very first tram being driven by the mayor at the time, James Hinton, on September the 22nd, 1904. And that's right outside where Local Studies is located. That's the town hall to the right. And it's just coming up through Regent Circus. And again, I mean, the sheer volume of people, I've never in my life ever seen that number of people in that part of the town for anything. So, I mean, it is absolutely staggering, really. And very easy to take for granted some of these photographs, but you just don't see crowds like that. In our collection, we have this very common postcard here of just the workers leaving the works. There were lots of these views, but the reason why I'm showing it to you tonight is it's got an interesting message on the back. A postmark there at Swindon Station on July the 2nd, 1906. And those of you who know about Swindon's history and know a bit about trams will know the significance. If we just skip over, we can see that it says, "Dear Mother and Father, just to say that I'm all right and not in accident. It was a bad smash. Hope all is well." And what the author of that card is referring to is the Swindon tram car disaster. This is from the 1st of June, the day before. And again, huge crowds again, as much as for the launch of the trams. And this is a picture taken by William Hooper, Swindon's most skillful and most notable photographer. In fact, most of the early views of Swindon from the Edwardian period at least are largely his, that people are most familiar with. If you don't know where that is, it's at the bottom of Victoria Hill. The tram had been travelling down the hill, and roughly where the tram is now, there's a triangular flower bed in the middle, which I've been told, but yet to establish that it's true, is a tribute to the victims of the tram crash. This picture by Hemmings shows them loading the bodies out. It made national headlines. It was very significant, really, not just because of the death, but because it was brand sparkling new technology, electricity and tramways, resulting in disaster. The tram was certainly overloaded. The police said that rather than 58 passengers, there may have been 80 on board, 30 injured, 5 died. And it's said by others elsewhere, although it's hard to establish, to quantify it, that Swindon suffered a serious loss of confidence over this, that it was one of the first real hiccups, or where something just went wrong and it didn't seem to suit the narrative where everything had been onwards and upwards and progress in every way. The last Swindon tram was in 1929. I did stumble across this. For many years, these were very big advertisers in the local press, the Swindon Electrical Engineering Company, who bafflingly makes steam cars. This is the locomotive steam car. It looks like an absolute death trap, but I'm sure that it was an expensive piece of kit in its day. And they also specialised in electric light installation. In terms of consumer goods, at that point, of course, lighting and cars, there was a very limited range of things on offer. We have this picture, which is local surgeon Thomas Sandy Coombe driving the first car in Purton. And we know exactly what make and model it is, because we have a rather wonderful book where you can look up early motor car registrations or owners and find out exactly what they had and even what colour it is. And I think this car was green from memory. And again, you know, the craze for cars and transport, but you can see that car in the foreground with the AM 1034 number plate. AM was the Wiltshire tag mostly in the first sort of wave of cars. And this is Devizes Road, and again, a shop showing off its stock. The other alternative for transport at that time was another likely looking death trap, was the Charabang. Lots of hilarious pictures of these. This is the one I'd least like to get on and go on a long journey. There's the Great Western Railway Stores Department in 1909, off on a trip. And I mean, that obviously led to a whole trade in cars. This is my favourite picture on that front, which is the premises of Ernest Clement Scurry, who was a corn dealer who expanded into cars, which is a very telling switch of sector, really, for Swindon. This is in the High Street in Old Town. If you don't know where this is where the Co-op supermarket sits now. It wasn't a Tudor building, by the way. I think it was a much later building, but it certainly was a rather attractive mock Tudor premises he had. And just around the corner on Victoria Road, I just like this picture for capturing some various transport options all in action there. This is the top of Victoria Road. The right-hand side is intact. This is the view from Pizza Express. On the left-hand side, that church was later demolished. Then it became a car park, and then it's just part of the road widening, leaving the museum adjacent to it as the next building, Aspen House. I'd included this. This is the original wooden diving stage at Coatwater, which was replaced in the 30s. And just really to mention that, of course, prior to the railways, that the canal would come through this area later than a lot of canals and in a way that was never really profitable. But it is a good example of pre-GWR engineering, as the Coatwater Reservoir damming the Dorking Brook was a man-made reservoir that was part of the water supply for the canal system. The blueprints are held at Chippenham. It's now a Grade 2 listed building, and it's rather wonderful Art Deco concrete thing. And these again are held at Chippenham at the County Record Office. These are the official opening of it. And recently we're given this rather wonderful picture, and it's the only time I've ever seen a picture of someone actually diving off Coatwater. Everyone, it's traditional in Swindon for your grandparents to tell you they used to jump off of the diving board. And there's someone actually in the water as well. I like Coatwater very much, but I've never wanted to get in it. So moving on then, really, during the Great War, Swindon GWR engineers made many contributions to the war, including this fantastic Continental ambulance train. I mean, the most notable contribution of the GWR was the gigantic amount of men who went to fight, and getting on for half of them died. We have all kinds of information, and for the GWR men who fought in the First World War, we mostly do have fantastic portrait photographs of them all. And there is a wonderful book called Swindon's War Record by Bavin, which we've created a kind of an affordable facsimile of, because the originals have become expensive collector's editions. But and a very good book by Mark Sutton called Tell Them of Us. But you can get in touch with me if you want to know more about that. And alongside the Continental train munitions factories across the borough, there's an article. This is from the 20s after the war, but showing you munition shells, well, 6-inch shells being forged at Swindon. And on the right-hand side, that picture shared with us by one of our regulars, with the tallest man in Swindon at the back, apparently. We don't have his name though. So moving on then past the First World War, in 1924, the Electrical Association for Women was formed by Mrs. M.L. Matthews under the auspices of the Women's Engineering Society. She had approached the IEE at that time, but couldn't get them to get involved. And I did find in our collection a number of their programs. These are much later, from the 60s and 70s. But anyone who's got a long-term involvement may recognise these names of Winslow, Catton, Gibney, Beisel, and so on. And you quite often see the same names in all these different organisations and teams and bodies. And then we've got an article here celebrating the creation of the Electrical Association in Swindon from 1933, and women and the use of electricity. And some good quotes here that electricity was the power of the age, and women want to know more. They want to have a voice. And in order to popularise the use of electricity, they must interest the women. That's from the North Wales Herald in 1933. And just so you know, we have like a complete collection of all local newspapers and every single Swindon advertiser and things, so we can try and trawl through to try and find things. This is the Art Deco styled Corporation Electricity showrooms on Regent Circus. Happily, that building is still there and looks pretty identical to that. It's now Rudy's Bar. It's had a lot of different uses through the years. And then obviously, as we move towards the Second World War, some very significant changes. The Ministry of Aircraft Production, the MAP, which was created in 1940, set up factories all across Swindon, including famously at Vickers, which we'll hear more about in a minute. The Vickers factory was going to be much larger, and there was a concern that it was too big and would be an easy target for the German bombers. And the reason why it was being created was Southampton had been destroyed. So they created smaller separate ones at Blunsdon and Sevenhampton. They also set up aircraft factories in Swindon Works and at Cambridge Street. And at that time, the Cambridge Street Works was Plessey with Armstrong Whitworth. And the picture is Swindon-built Stirling bomber fuselages. We were given a fantastic book by one of our regulars on, I think it's called In the Cause of War, and it's a complete account from the late 40s about Swindon's contribution to the war effort in terms of aircraft. And I think it's unique. It's not in the British Library. I've never seen it anywhere else. It's wonderful. And that came from there. Vickers at South Marston made the Mark 21 Supermarine Spitfires. X-ray therapy equipment, I believe, but I can't prove it tonight. They made the equipment used in the first ever heart transplants. They didn't make a great deal of the Spitfires, but they made about 120, I think, of that model and another model. There we go. There's Vickers Armstrong Aircraft Limited. And there's a lot of pictures tonight are going to be these kind of premises, which were all built at a very similar time. As you may also know, Christopher Cockerell famously invented hovercraft himself with hoovers and tin cans during the 50s, really. But the very first passenger jet, the very first passenger carrying model hovercraft to actually come into commercial use was the VA3, which was built in Swindon by Vickers Armstrong. There were air raids in Swindon, not a lot, and it doesn't appear to be deliberately targeted. I don't think it was spared for any strategic reasons. It just wasn't significant enough. And I think it's generally believed that the bombing raids from 40 and 42 were bombers returning from Bristol with excess munitions to drop off. But people did die, and it did hit those streets: Beatrice Street, Drove Road, Ferndale Road, and so on. But what's interesting in the press coverage of these, and you may be familiar with this phenomenon, but even in the Swindon Advertiser on the front page with pictures of bombs, it doesn't name Swindon. So an example there from 1940, that bombs on homes in the south, 10 believed killed, 2 girls rescued from collapsed house. So not to confirm for any German spies that they were successful. He goes press cutting there. And again, that's from the Swindon Advertiser, and the caption at the bottom says wrecked houses in another part of a town, of a south of England town. And you've got the war damage contribution certificate next to it, which is a scheme to kind of help people who are on the receiving end of that damage. So following the Second World War, consumer goods, really. I mean, I know it's a cliche, but it's true that there was a kind of boom in the development of goods for the consumer. And one of our favorite pictures is this shoppers on Regent Street. If you need to get your bearings, this is Regent Street just before the crossroads, which you can see there with Canal Walk. So that's effectively the Canal Bridge in the middle of that street. And there's a close-up of the shop window, people crowded round to view the TVs and radios that are on sale, or mostly for rent, of course, because what we're looking at there is radio rentals. And it's 1957, this picture. And again, you had another view of it there, slightly later. In 1950, to mark the borough's silver jubilee, you can see really the thinking of the council at that time and their eyes on the future. They held a gigantic industrial exhibition. It was mostly staged at Milton Road Baths, and it celebrated the firms already here, like Vickers and Plessy and Marine Mountains and others. And my library service too was one of the few non-firms included in that. And the idea was to attract more employers. And that's the cover of the programme that we have in our collection, and an illustration from it of a woman working in Plessy. And then what happened was Swindon showed extraordinary foresight, really, in using the 1952 Town Development Act to shape its future. The Act really was designed to relieve congestion in London, largely, but drawing on the GWR kind of base and all that engineering strength, Swindon managed to attract a large number of engineering and manufacturing firms to relocate to Swindon, often moving into these brand new buildings designed by the borough architects. And then additionally to that, the existing firms continue to expand and make a permanent home here. And then all of this underpins the London Overspill, which saw 20,000 people arrive to the town, mostly from Greater London, including my grandparents on one side. And really, Swindon at that point has set the stage to avoid some of the perils of a one-industry town. And on the right, there is an advert from a local a national newspaper offering Swindon services and inviting firms to get in touch, looking for new premises. And we have a lot of that material through the decades, really, the town offering itself as a good location for these firms. The firms that did arrive, things like Shawco, the metal box company, who built their factory at Cheney Manor and were there for a long time. It's a wonderful shot of all the staff cars all there lined up. And Square D, who opened another factory at Cheney Manor in 1962. Again, all this quite distinctive architecture of that time. Brown Brothers, they were slightly further afield. They were kind of motor parts, really, a little bit later on. Quite demolished in 2007. This is near Greenbridge Drake's Way roundabout. Most notably, perhaps, the Press Steel Company Limited at Stratford St Margaret, and that sort of view there from the sort of late 50s. But when we go overleaf, you can see some of the internal pictures. They began building this on this site on very boggy farmlands next to the railway lines in 1954. There was actually a small branch line that went straight into the factory. And they managed to get the first 2 presses up and running by December the next year. And that's despite, and this is detailed in quite sort of gripping accounts in their company information about full gales, snow, and as they had to drag everything over to its site, that one of the presses sank deep into the mud. They had to dig 20 feet underneath it to get it out. And you can see that aerial view there of the site. And there's another view of it. That front there, the column front, I believe, has been demolished now. That's where it says Press Steel Company Limited in 63. And then you've got a slightly later view where it says British Leyland. It became part of British Leyland. Then Rover. I actually did my school work experience in that factory in the drawing office. Like almost every child at my school, we all did our work experience in Rover. And then the site was acquired by BMW. And to this day, it produces 90%, because it's according to BMW's website, 90% of the body components for the BMW Mini. Another major firm were Plessey, who famously made semiconductors, but as a list there of all the things they make there, electrolytic capacitors and resistors and other components. They had premises, obviously, as we know from the wartime, at Kembury Street and at Cheney Manor later, covering 39 acres of land total. There's their famous machine shop at Kembury Street. It was set up, as we said, in the wartime to produce aircraft equipment. It credits the success of that site to an extremely enthusiastic, almost entirely female workforce that were hugely inexperienced and yet really made it a huge success, such that by the end of the war, they turned it into a permanent Swindon group. Just the scale of production that's going on in that room. By 1950, they were producing 6 million parts a week. By 64, there were 4,500 people working there. And it was claimed in several places, I don't know how we could prove it, that every UK household contained at least one item made by Plessey at Kembury Street, which is a rather wonderful idea. Garrards have been in the town for quite a while. We have all their staff magazines, and the museum has a big collection of their turntables, which, as some of you will know, were extremely well regarded. And almost every year, somebody will wander into local studies, often from Scandinavia, very, very excited to be in Swindon, the home of Garrards, and talk to me about turntables with great enthusiasm. They came back in 1919. They actually ended up being owned by Plessey. They made a whole range of products, really, but their turntables are what made them most famous. And I found a picture of the Garrard girls, as they're described there, assembling radiogram pickups in 34. And again, they had a wartime function. That invoice from our collection there shows that they were contractors to the Admiralty, the War Office and the Air Ministry. And again, their adverts, and that advert there is from the 30s, I think, really sort of going for style and sort of lifestyle aspirational thing, like to own a Garrard turntable was quite a thing. And British Rail, obviously the newly nationalised form of the railways, of which Swindon Works became a part, and they continued to innovate. There were major innovations in what the site did. It stopped really being a factory making trains to one that repaired trains, but they did begin to make diesel locomotives. And here, from 56, they're showcasing their new electronic accounting system. And some illustrations from that. Wonderfully, that booklet, which someone gave to us a couple of years ago, includes some of the punch cards that the woman's holding in the photograph in the middle. Dolores Stellite, there was a Canadian firm, quite a complex history and a complex set of products. They moved into Stratton St Margaret, almost adjacent to the Press Steel firm. I have no idea what the thing on the right does, but it's a photograph we were given by the firm. It's something to do with plasma. I guess you guys may know more. They completed their factory, 27 acres of it by 61. And according to their own history, they retained 65% of their employees in the move from Shirley in Birmingham, which seems to me extraordinary. And there's an aerial view with their logo. And this is Swindon Road if you were heading up from Greenbridge towards Ermine Street on the left-hand side. And this kind of appeal to employers to relocate and to bring their firms seemed to be successful and continue for many, many decades. Burma Castrol came here in 73, a couple of years after the M4 was fully opened in Swindon. We've got some fantastic aerial pictures of the M4 being constructed and the huge earthworks that took locally. This is a picture of their computer room at Swindon. Fantastic bit of kit there. And that brochure was aimed at their existing employees. It was called A Place in the Country, and it was selling them the benefits of relocating out to Swindon, brand new house and a garden, and live on these purpose-built estates at places like Walcott, Penhill, Park South, Park North, have a garden and have some space and have a new job. 76, I mean, it's topical at the moment for not necessarily for good reasons, but there's the Oasis with Concorde flying over the top, which I think both were brand new in 1976. Swindon Cable, which has a very complicated history and it's quite hard to reconstruct quickly, but it had a number of firsts. I believe it was the first pay-per-view, and it was the first commercial UK cable television station. When I was a kid, everyone had Swindon Cable and there were local programs on it. There's a wonderful website and that hosts a lot of that old content. It's been digitized and they're working very hard to digitize all of it. It goes right back to these adverts from 1928 for the Radio Relay Exchange, where you could listen to the BBC and Continental and American stations there from your fireside. And indeed, on the left-hand side, there's actually a picture of sat by the fire listening to their radio. They were based in Victoria Road. And I managed to find an announcement of the official opening of it as Swindon Cable. It was happening all over the country, but it seems like Swindon got in there first in a number of ways on that front. I mean, one of my own connections to this is that I was heavily involved in the temporary move of Central Library into these premises here on Princes Street. That's now a gym, but we were there for 2 years. We made sure we didn't stay there forever by calling it the temporary Central Library, you'll notice. And they built our new building for us. But that building prior to us living there was Nationwide's building. And as we understand it, and Nationwide obviously are based in Swindon, and they have their archives in Kenbury Park, and they have their own archivist, and they got a fantastic collection of information there. Paramount was actually built for Nationwide to house their only computer. I managed to find an advert from 1979 there asking for trainee computer programmers to come to live in Swindon. I think that was from the Daily Mirror, that advert. And this was the computer they had there, the Sperry Univac 1100 with 98K of main memory. It was connected to these other Sperry terminals at each of the branches, and it was built deliberately just 200 yards away from the telephone exchange in Swindon and to their various data centres. We hear, anecdotally, that it used so much power, it dimmed the lights of nearby houses. And it certainly did the job. I mean, it ran an entire building society. As I mentioned earlier, the Swindon's electricity at this point was now being generated by Morden Power Station, which was then demolished in 1979. I have got some good pictures of that happening, but much nicer are these ones from 1953. We call them the man with a stick photographs. They are from the Ordnance Survey. Someone gave them to us back in 2006. One of the very few sets in the whole country that survive, and they're all taken in 1953, 54, and I spend a great deal of professional time trying to work out where a photograph was taken and when. And what's wonderful about these is they are dated with a grid reference, which is staggeringly unusual. But you can see the top left photograph, that's the River Ray running under a bridge on the old Purton Road with the tower behind you. Intow came to Swindon around 1980, operating both from Dorking House and the Techno Trading Estate as well. They weren't manufacturing computer components at that stage, but they were distributing them and running other functions. That's from the Evening Post, again, advertising for people to come to live and work in Swindon. And whilst not really in electricity, electronics or engineering, the famous multi-award winning building by Norman Foster, the Spectrum in Wesley, built 81, 82, is the distribution centre for Renault. You may remember it when it had kind of deconstructed Renault cars suspended in behind the glass. You can kind of view those a little bit through this photograph. It was used in 1984 for the awful James Bond movie, A View to a Kill. And the reason I mention that is, we'll come apparent later. EMI came to Swindon, and in 1987, they actually produced the world's very first Beatles CDs. And accordingly, now the road off of Drake's Way, where it was located, is called Abbey Road. I managed to dig up my own copies of those CDs, and you have to look very carefully. On the back, very small with magnifying glass, you'll see EMI Swindon on some of those Beatles CDs. And obviously around the 80s, really, and a bit later on, the industries in Swindon changed to office-based financial industries, Allied Dunbar, Zurich, Hambro, and so on. And we've already had Nationwide come in. This is the construction of Peter Carter's award-winning Tri-Centre building, possibly 1991. You can see the Octagon Cafe there in front of you, if you know that. And this is from up on the car park, the Corkscrew car park that's now been demolished. Motorola also poised to become a giant in the mobile phone, but never quite had the same success you might have anticipated. Again, advertising for jobs there in the Daily Mirror. They came in 1989, first to Blade Grove and then to this award-winning building in Groundwell, which was used in another Bond film in 1999, The World Is Not Enough. This is now the building for a company called Vigon, the Pierre Simonet building. I know very little about that firm at the moment. And just looking at the time, I think we're getting to the end now. Honda, that's a nice photograph of the Honda site. It was purchased from, well, initially that was the Vickers Armstrong site. You can see the airfield and runways. And that ended up being Honda's global production hub with 3,500 associates, as it described its staff. And at one stage, it claimed that a new car rolled off their line every 69 seconds. They bought the site in 85 and opened the plant in 89. Producing their millionth car by 2003. It's got a number of firsts. I've put one there. It was the first UK hydrogen refueling station. But sadly, it did announce its closure, which is to happen this year. But it is being sold to a gigantic firm called Panattoni, who have committed to invest 700 million into the site. Yes, okay. And just to kind of end on, I do remember when I was a student at Swindon College, at one point, all the vending machines were taken away and replaced with new vending machines that you couldn't use coins on. Instead, you had to use a swipe card that you had to refill with the coins at special swipe card cashing up stations. And a year or so later, it led to this, Mondex, which was trialled in Swindon. It was a £50 million scheme for 2 years, attempting to make Swindon the world's first cashless town. And it launched on July the 3rd, 95. And it really did make international news. Now, a lot of attention paid to it. The top left photograph is a billboard at the back saying it's Cash Swindon, but not as you know it. And they're next to the White House Bridge, which is perhaps a less favourable image of Swindon's engineering history, notorious as it is. And digging through our collection, I did find this from April 1995, a promo leaflet from Mondex, which genuinely has a real penny stuck to the front of it, confidently telling us that after July 1995, you won't need this. So, yeah, I think it just to kind of take us to the end of that, really, that Swindon today, there's getting on for 250,000 people living there. According to the latest figures I could find, there were still 10,000 working in advanced engineering of various kinds, contributing about £1 billion to the UK economy. And there are still 450 digital technology firms and others based there. And obviously, we still have BMW and some other large engineering. So that's my talk. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't get too many things wrong. And I would really like to thank Graham, Turner, Rita and Walter for their generosity in allowing me to come and speak to you tonight. And I'm very happy to take questions. So I will just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Daryl. That was fantastic. I don't think we could have asked for a better overview of Swindon's history with a bit of IET history interwoven into that. So yeah, it was fascinating. And having been a resident for for Swindon for some time. It's really interesting to see how it all came together, and so many things I didn't know, I guess. From the early photos showing how much countryside there originally was around Swindon. I guess that's still the case, but you just have to go a little bit further.
Yeah.
And then as a keen cyclist, I certainly enjoyed hearing about Swindon's cycling heritage, which again, I had no idea that bikes were actually produced here and what have you. And then hovercraft is another interesting one in that I remember crossing the channel in the hovercraft as a kid, but I know you can still do that to the Isle of Wight, but I think the channel crossings on the hovercraft no longer happen. But yeah, I won't witter on, but I'll talk about the questions. So I see we've got a number of questions already, so I'll pose those. But if you have questions, please, as I say, raise those in the Q&A box. So some of them are quite specific. So I've got a first one, which regards what was the purpose of the man with a stick photographs, please?
I wish there was a nice simple answer, and there's not. I do know one notable local historian who tried to really nail down exactly what was happening and what the numbers meant and kind of gave up. The wonderful Swindon Heritage magazine, edited by Graham Carter, which ran for 5 years, covered it very well. And they tracked down a former man with a sticks assistant. But broadly, what they were doing was visiting exact grid references, finding a stable physical point, literally pointing at it and taking a picture, so that when they revised the maps, they could actually check those positions. And on the Ordnance Surveys for 56, you can see the letters RP appear quite frequently scattered over those maps. And usually where you see an RP, we actually have that photograph, RP33A or something. We should have it. That's a whole talk in itself, and I know someone does that much better than I do.
I think there's one which I think is to provide some help. So regards the ECA safety leaflet is post 1922 when the induction coil logo was first used. So it's suggested it may have been post 1929, as the ECA issued a booklet entitled that in 1929. So that's
fantastic.
A helpful one. That's why I love you sort of find out these snippets of information that you just wouldn't have known. Another question, and in the aerial photo of the GWR Park and Church, there was a large house by the railway line. And the question is, was this the chief mechanical engineer's house? I'll still ask the question, even though it's not regarding the IET.
Okay, I think from memory, I think the house they're talking to, given the view, is actually the vicarage next to St Mark's Church, which is now Playsteps Nursery. There were larger houses, one facing the park on Church Place that's closer to Farringdon Road. But if I understand the question right, I think that house was the St Mark's Vicarage.
Okay, rather than I should have clarified that Daniel Gucci's house. Here we go. I did see one. It's in the chat. That's why. Question on what happened to the Plessy site. I must admit I hadn't realised that Plessy had been in Swindon.
It's very complicated, and this is where I get lost in the various takeovers and changes and redevelopments. That there is the easiest answer would be to dig out a load of old maps and just show you gradually how it shifted and changed and what replaced it. I don't have a good off-the-cuff answer for that one, sadly. But I mean, we do get these kind of questions, and you mentioned earlier development of all these greenfield sites. Sometimes the best answer is a visual one, where we can just sit with these very large Ordnance Survey maps we have, and you can just look at a site and flick through these different surveys, say 1900, 1923, and you can just see these shifts of usage, and also notably these fields gradually turning to neat little rows of terrace houses or industrial estates. So it would just be a question of locating the site and flipping through it on there.
Yeah, it's incredible. And a more forward-looking one now, I guess. We've heard the history, but the question relates to the next 50 years. They're not asking you to look quite so far into the future for the next 150 years, but so the question is, what plans and potential new facilities do you envisage to make excellent archive material as this, as well as other library services that are freely accessible to the public. So
yeah, I mean,
envisaging that enabling technology will continue to evolve.
It's a brilliant question, and it's one which everyone in my sector really should have, that should be considering all the time. You're always trying to move forward. Libraries are always trying very hard to be at the front of these changes. Digitization is obviously one big wave that never stops. There's always more things we could digitize. Finding sustainable long-term ways of doing it, though, is very hard. It's still probably true that if you want to preserve a photograph, your best option is, rather than digitize it, is to print it on very high quality paper and store it somewhere archivally and acid free and somewhere safe and dark and moisture free. But digitization and making things available to people is something we're always trying to work at. They're incredibly resource hungry, and you're all now probably familiar with your own kind of digital black holes, where we've all got probably a period in our lives where all our holiday photos were happily stored on CDs that have all disappeared, or it's sustainable long-term planning is the thing. And because libraries are all broadly interconnected, the sector can kind of move as a whole gradually towards these solutions. But yeah, it's I agree about making it widely available, and lockdown has really underlined just how much of our material really we want to make more freely available online. And I suppose just to add on to that, there, if you go to www.flickr.com/Swindon Local, that's our online gallery, which I started back in 2009, I think. And sometime this week, it will pass its 35 millionth visit. And we've got about 12,500 pics on there. So we are trying to make that content available online.
Fantastic. Another question on, I guess, a big thanks for the presentation. But the question is, do you think Swindon is exceptional in terms of engineering history as opposed to some other locations? And if so, why? I for one, am now convinced, but I'll hand it over to you.
I've been asked this like live on camera by news crews sometimes, and I've never really been able to give a good answer to it. I think that locally we tend to overstate the significance of the GWR, when I think they were just a very good, very famous railway company, but there were lots of others. They certainly have all kinds of milestone achievements, including the fastest, the Cheltenham Flyer and things like this. But even researching this talk, it strikes me that something quite remarkable happened in Swindon, certainly following the Second World War, and it seems to be led from the top. And they managed to survive almost, if you think it was entirely a railway town, and pretty much by the closure of the works, there was really very little railway employment left, although the electrification training school is there at the moment. I do think there's something remarkable about it, and it feels like a coherent town-wide investment and belief in the town's engineering base as it's the best thing to invest in for its future. I mean, I could have spoken tonight entirely about the technical college, the Northwoods Technical College on Victoria Hill, really, as being the kind of beacon for all of this and training generations and generations of these engineers in all these fields.
I'm getting some good, helpful facts here as well. Regarding the electricity conversion station, there was a mercury arc rectifier station in Manchester Road until around 1970. Now a 33 11 kV substation. I like this one off topic, but I think we're all interested when we can hear the man with the stick lecture.
There's a gentleman by the name of Andy Binks from the Swindon Society who gives a talk just on the man with a stick, and it's absolutely fascinating. And I strongly recommend, if you see it advertised anywhere, then to go along.
Oh, great, thank you. So there's a question on appreciating the fact the presentation didn't cover the power industry, but curious to know how the CEGB National Power RWE came to have such a large presence in Swindon.
Yeah, I mean, I think they followed a very similar route, really. I mean, I think once you added in the GWR main line being built, the M4, and then the huge industrial base and engineering base that came out of that, it started to be, I think, very close to the top of people's lists when they were looking to build somewhere, rather than it became, and then also because M Power's headquarters are in Swindon, aren't they? And we had things like we have the Research Council, the European Space Agency, well, the UK Space Agency now, of course, and the Water Research Council, and so many others. I think that I think it started to develop its own gravitational pull, I would say, in various industries.
Mm-hmm.
But I would need to do more research to give you a more sensible answer to that, I think.
Some comments on the computer sizes. So in 1964, visited the Comet 4C simulator at Lynham, where they were celebrating getting the computer into one room. Previously it occupied 4, which is it's incredible, really, isn't it? Another comment that Raychem had a big presence at one time and still do, and they had a big effect on the techniques in the electricity supply industry.
I can see that question from Tony. I'm thinking the thing is that when I started to do this, I realized that I ended up having to skim through all of these sectors and fields and firms. And yeah, Raychem and Tyco and other related industries were huge in the town, and some still are. And they all have this, again, the number of sort of significant firsts in the town and significant engineering, electrical, and technical and digital innovations and inventions seems huge. And there isn't really a good book. There's a book to be written, isn't there, on Swindon purely from this point of view. You know, but I agree, Raychem absolutely a massive impact, and serious world players in that as well, and so were Tyco.
Yeah, interesting about facts on electrical conversion stations supplying DC to some of the old houses in relation to Headlands Grammar School. And then, yeah, highlighting that CEGB originally had offices at the old Morden power station site.
Yeah, I mean, on Morden, there are some fantastic pictures of people basically sat down having picnics on the grass next to it while it's being blown up and the chimney's being demolished. So
yeah. Well, I think we're at the top of the hour. I think we've just about got through all the questions. So thank you for providing excellent answers on all of those. And my thanks from the Swindon Local Network Committee for agreeing to support tonight's presentation, and my thanks from all the audience. We had an excellent number of participants, which clearly shows there's an avid interest in Swindon's heritage.
Should hope so too. And also I'd like to say, as I mentioned previously, is if you have any questions or any follow-up, you're very welcome to email us at localstudies@swindon.gov.uk. And once conditions allow, we'd like to invite Swindon's IET and whether individually or collectively, to come and I'll show you around the collection, and we can have a real dig through, because I've tried to guess and gauge really what you might find interesting, but I'm sure we've got all kinds of weird, wonderful, and sometimes frankly disgusting things you might find fun to pick around with and have a look at.
That's a fantastic offer, and yeah, much appreciated.
Thank you.
Just to highlight as well, the session, I should have said this at the start, the session has been recorded and it will be on our YouTube channel, which you can find at our Swindon Communities page. I think the link will be sent out. There'll be a feedback email going out to request feedback on tonight's talk. So, looking for feedback on tonight's talk and potentially ideas for future presentations that you'd like to see. And also the site will provide an overview of our upcoming events, which we hope will start to resume at some point face to face. But I think realistically, it'll be towards the latter half of this year, if not even 2022. But we'll certainly keep the members updated in terms of what we're able to offer and what have you. And so with that, I'll say thanks again to Daryl, and wish you all a good evening. And
thank you very much.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Goodbye.